Hello, everyone. Nice to see you on my channel, Touching Stories. Today you will hear an amazing story that is based on real events. It's a drama that will be a very important lesson for everyone. At the checkout counter, the older woman looked at her purse with a confused look and did not understand where her purse had gone. She wasn't even sure that she had taken it with her on her trip. The fare was in a separate pocket, so she didn't even reach for her wallet, immersed in sad thoughts. She had probably just forgotten it at home. Carefully examining the contents of the pockets and not too fancy pants, clearly hand-knitted, the woman gave the cashier change and said, "Count it, please. This should be enough." The girl began to count the coins, after a while disappointedly held out. "No, I don't have enough dimes. See if you can find some more coins somewhere." Despite the fact that the time was not too early, there were practically no people in the store. Behind the older woman in line was only one middle-aged man. He put a bottle of beer and a pack of snacks on the band and was looking forward to having a breakfast of these products and then most likely going to bed because he didn't have to go to his shift until the evening shift. The man looked a little wrinkled, but he looked with disdain at the role for which he could not pay the old woman. He even took the liberty of making a joke and flaunting the knowledge he had picked up from magazines. Well, by the way, are you following Marie Antoinette's advice? When there is no money for bread, you eat cakes. The elderly woman began to check her bag and pockets even more diligently for money, but to no avail. Looking at the girl sitting at the cash register, the hapless customer asked, "Honey, can you sell me a bun now? I'll bring the money tomorrow. I don't think I can make it back today. I'll give it to you first thing tomorrow morning." The cashier felt a little pity for the sincerely upset old lady, but she feared that the man standing behind the hapless customer would start a scandal. The girl tried not to show her irritation and politely offered, "If you want, you can take a cheaper bun. I'll take this position off and then take the other one." However, the old lady disagreed. "You know, I do not buy for myself, but for my daughter. This is exactly the kind of bread she likes. Please understand my situation. I cannot come to my little girl without a gift." The man in line hummed and grumbled softly, seemingly to no one in particular. "Women are always spoiling their princesses, and then they grow up, and there's a whole chorus of them. They should have done it like in the army. Put a dish on the table to eat, and that's it." The old woman paid no attention to the talkative man. "Those with a crown on their heads get married, and normal men are tormented with them." But the man dreaming of a scandal did not make the cashier complacent, and she said firmly, "If you do not have enough money and are not going to take anything else, please do not delay the queue." She still hoped that somewhere in one of her pockets she would find some change. She could hear perfectly well as the girl, still working, shared her indignation with the next customer. "Here we go all day long with this kind of nonsense. Someone forgot his card, someone was a little short. All say that just right away will give. But in fact, what?" The girl waved her hand in frustration, scanned the few purchases, asked the sacramental phrase about the package, and, hearing a negative answer, voiced the amount. The man put the card to the terminal and suddenly decided, as a customer who is always right, to teach the cashier about life. "You know, in general, you should be kinder. Why are you so untrusting? Anne can't wish her daughter a happy birthday because of a stupid accident." The strict cashier got really angry and burst out with an angry speech, taking advantage of the fact that there were no other customers. "Why didn't you are so kind and generous? Why didn't you offer to pay for the woman's purchase? She only lacked a dime. Everyone knows how to give advice, but no one can really help. I was naive at first. I believed that they would bring me money and give it to me. Of course, someone brought their debts. Even once they brought money and gave me about a kilo of wild strawberries as a bonus. But I was tired of paying my own money for someone else's forgetfulness. That's how I stopped being trusting." The old woman did not even hear the end of the conversation. She was desperate to find the money and went outside. She was ashamed to beg, but there was no other way out. By all means, she had to buy a loaf and bring it to her beloved daughter. This goal drove the woman to go begging. Edamona had never done it before. Trying to suppress her shame, the old woman dared to approach the well-groomed lady, striding proudly in her high heels, and asked her, "Forgive me generously. Please lend me a few coins. I absolutely need to buy a loaf. The amount is not enough." However, the woman's request was simply ignored. The beautiful woman, beating out a shot with her heels, silently walked past as if the woman was an empty space, and left behind the scent of an intrusive, heavy perfume. The old woman hurried to meet the young mother who was wheeling the baby stroller and said, "But please lend me a couple of coins. I can pay you back on the phone later. I really need it." The young woman said no to the old woman and told her that she could have used the money herself. An attempt to borrow the missing tenner from a guy who was leaning against the fence near the parking lot and was sipping mineral water from a plastic bottle with pleasure also ended unsuccessfully. He wiped his lips with the back of his hand, smiled fervently, and confessed simple-heartedly, "Yeah, I drank all my wages yesterday. I'm sorry, Granny, but I can't help. I used the last of my money to buy water. It looks like I'll start begging on my own." No one rushed to give the old woman the cherished change, and she was close to despair. After all, it would take not only time, but strength, of which she did not have much, to return home for her purse and then drive to the neighborhood again. Rescheduling the visit was out of the question. Her beloved Emily was to receive her favorite bun. Exactly on her birthday, when the old lady saw a beautiful foreign car parked nearby, a man got out of it and headed for the entrance of the store. The woman thought that the owner of such a car would hardly be stingy with a modest handout and rushed toward him, feeling both ashamed and hopeful. It was difficult for the woman to catch up with the tall and obviously athletic man. He was receding swiftly, and she, afraid of missing the chance, actually spoke into his back. "If you don't mind, help me, for heaven's sake." The man turned to the petitioner without even looking at her, took out his wallet and pulled out a paper bill of rather large denomination. With this amount you could buy a dozen buns, and the old woman began to ask the generous man how she could give him the money. "You see, I'm not a pauper. I just found myself in such a situation that you could cry. I didn't have my purse in my bag, and I was just a few coins short. When I get home, I can go straight to the bank and send you a money order or send it to my phone." The stranger, who had already prepared to brush the woman off, suddenly began to scrutinize her face, and then stretched out in surprise. "Aunt Anne, it's you." The woman was confused. Her name was really Evgenia, but she did not remember the man standing in front of her. He noticed the old woman's confusion and began to explain. "I am Thomas. 15 years ago, you and your husband, Mark, saved me from trouble. If it hadn't been for you, I don't know how things would have turned out. Don't you remember?" There was a spark of joy on the woman's face. She gasped, recognizing in the man Thomas, whom she remembered as a frightened, pain-stricken young man. That late evening, 15 years ago, she was returning from work. Anne's respectable age did not allow her to argue with her newly appointed boss, and she had to stay late in order to turn in the drawings in time for a very important order. Despite the height of summer, it was chilly and dark. It was a good thing public transportation was still running. The woman could probably walk the familiar route from the bus stop to her home with her eyes closed. Gray clouds covered the sky in the afternoon. It was obvious that it was about to rain. Individual drops had already hit Anne, and she increased her steps. She regretted now that she had talked her husband, who had called her at work out of meeting her. It would have been more fun to walk together. We could talk about Emily's daughter, who had recently married and gone to another city with her husband. Anne missed her very much, and talking about her now. So grown, independent daughter seemed to bring her closer to her. It was too difficult for Anne to give birth to her daughter, and it seemed to her that the long-grown girl still needed uninterrupted maternal care. The woman even began to think about moving to her son-in-law's hometown. She would be interested to hear her husband's opinion on the idea. Emily had promised to come for the weekend, and it was necessary to consider what to treat her to. Gianni had no doubt that her husband would suggest some original dish. Besides, it was good to discuss with him how to spend the approaching vacation. There is little you can talk about with a man with whom you have lived together soul to soul for a quarter of a century. Even walking in silence beside Mark would be a blessing. Wrapping herself tightly in the new blouse she had thrown on in the morning, Anne was almost running toward the house. Already there, in the light in the native kitchen window on the second floor showed up. But at the very entrance, she dared to ask, "Boy, did you go woo?" The stranger opened his eyes and confessed, "Yes, but don't give me away, please. If you can lend me money for travel and some civilian clothes, I'll pay you back. But later, please. I have to get home." Anne felt maternal pity for someone's son who was obviously in a difficult situation. She asked sympathetically, "What happened to you?" The boy noisily exhaled, explaining the reason for his unpresentable appearance. "Managed to squeeze myself between the wagons of a freight train to get to my hometown, but had to jump off when the railroad spotted me at one of the stations. I rushed to escape, but I didn't consider that my legs got stiff from sitting in an uncomfortable squatting position for so long. It was very unfortunate that I fell several times. The appearance of the clothes was quite consistent with this version, and the railroad was nearby. So everything so far in the guy's speech was coherent." Anne clarified, "Did you hurt yourself?" The guy wasn't being disingenuous and said that his leg seemed to be injured. "I must have pulled it. It hurts to step on it. It took me a while to get here." The woman wondered if the guy really needed help, or if it would be better to just walk on by. However, after a brief deliberation, her compassion was stronger than her fears, and Anne invited the stranger into her apartment. "Come on, let's go see what's wrong with your leg. Just keep in mind, if you're up to something bad, don't even think about bringing it to fruition. I have a husband at home, and he's ex-military." The stranger, whose forehead was covered with sweat from the pain, assured me that he was up to no harm. His excited speech was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Anne's husband came out of the staircase and anxiously inquired, "Anne, what took you so long?" I was beginning to worry. Something happened. However, the man did not need an answer. He took one look at the pale sufferer, understood roughly what had happened, and suggested, "Tell you what, young man, let me help you up from the bench. And you come up to us from the bench, and you come up to us and at least get yourself back to normal. Eat, tell us what happened to you in peace. We'll think about what to do next." Anne was glad that her husband, not even knowing about her decision to help the boy, had offered him the same option that had occurred to her. Once again, she thought about how lucky she was to have met Mark, her support and backbone in all things. The climb up to the second floor was difficult for the boy. He held on to the handrail with one hand and leaned on the man with the other, who distracted him from his pain by talking to him. "My name is Mark. My wife's name is Anne. You can call us Uncle Mark and Aunt Anne if you want." "Sounds good to me. What's your name?" Soldier reintroduced himself in response. "I'm Thomas." Fortunately for the exhausted boy, he had to go up a short distance, and soon he was entering the apartment of his hospitable new acquaintances. He had barely begun to ask for money to get to his town when Mark interrupted him without listening. "Now Anne will give you some clean clothes and a towel. Get yourself cleaned up, and we'll have dinner. You can tell me all about it later, and we'll see if you need to go back to your hometown. Anne will wash and repair your clothes later as much as he can." Thomas tried to say that he really needed to get to his hometown as soon as possible, but Mark was already leading him to the bathroom door. And Anne, returning from the room where she had gone almost unnoticed, was handing the boy, promptly assembled, a set of clean clothes and fresh towels. After sending her guest to wash up, the couple looked at each other and went into the kitchen. Evgenia was glad that her husband did not reproach her for talking to the guy, and was once again pleased with the mutual understanding in the family. The woman began quickly setting the table. By the time Thomas entered the kitchen, embarrassedly crumpling her soldier's clothes in her hands, Anne had managed to heat up soup and stew, and even brewed strong tea. Constantine had time to quickly examine the boy's sore leg and quickly issued a verdict. Simple a sprain. It's nothing serious. Now put some ointment on it, a little bandage. The abrasions were treated. Fortunately, they were not too deep and I could sit at the table with no worries. After the medical treatment, the hosts wished the uninvited guest a good appetite. Anne discovers an escaped soldier on the porch of her house. Thomas tried to say that he needed to get to his hometown as soon as possible, but Mark jokingly reminded him, "We've always said to our daughter, and sometimes still say while I eat, I am deaf and dumb, so show respect for the folk wisdom and culinary talents of my Anne, and just enjoy the food." When the treats were over and the boy had removed his hunger, Mark inquired, "Now tell me what got you away from the service." The guy lowered his head, and the landlord gave an almost military command. "A report, Thomas." The guy, whose face had already taken on a normal hue, sank even more, but began to tell. "Letter came to me a week ago, from my best friend, Andrew, who I thought was the closest thing I had to family after my own father. Andrew and I have been friends since high school, but he managed to get a job at the commercial department of the Institute, and I was drafted to serve. When I went into the army, I asked him to protect my girlfriend if necessary, and that he wouldn't let anyone molest her. Julia's a beauty. She'd throw her hair back and show her neck. I almost went crazy. A lot of guys went for her, but she chose me. She promised to wait for me from the army. I was worried that my competitors would be trying to get at her in my absence, and my best friend was my biggest rival. But what kind of friend is he to me now? I trusted Andrew as I trusted myself, and he told me in a letter that he loved Julia and that she was not indifferent to him. So he decided to tell me himself, not to wait for someone he knew to tell me. So he lost his best friend and his fiancée. Andrew apologized in his letter, telling me not to blame Julia or him. What's in it for me with his apology? He even wrote that he had already proposed to my now ex-fiancée and received her consent, trying to justify it. What she really didn't say, when was the last time I talked to her on the phone? She wrote that she was afraid to tell me everything because she was afraid of my inadequate reaction. As if a double betrayal can somehow be calmly, adequately accepted. Can you imagine? Andrew reported that they even set a wedding day. Mark and Anne listened to their guest and did not even interrupt him with sympathetic remarks. Any words of comfort would have sounded trite and formulaic. It was noticeable that as Thomas spoke, his speech became more and more agitated. The guy bitterly uttered, "Just this Friday is when the wedding is due to take place. So I wanted to make the celebration a little more bitter for these traitors. I wanted to punch my sworn friend in the face, and I wanted to look that white-haired rat in the eye and spit in his face. I went to the platoon commander and explained to him, on my honor, why I needed a short leave. And he, the heartless bastard, told me not to play dumb. I tried to talk some sense into him. I begged him, but he wouldn't let me. So I had to go AWOL the night before yesterday. If it hadn't been for an unfortunate accident, I would have been on my way to my town. But I think I can still make it home in time for the wedding. If you can lend me some money, I'll pay you back, I promise." Thomas stopped talking and stared intently one by one into Anne and Mark's eyes. And the owner of the house, patted on the shoulder, expressed his own opinion. "Hey, kid, you shouldn't scold your commander. He was right not to let you go. You were so desperate. I could see you were so messed up in the civilian life that it would be a disaster. You'd have been a pain in the ass to clean up later. You could have ended up behind bars if your plan hadn't gone wrong. It's a good thing your journey was cut short. Listen to me and try to think with your head and not with your resentful heart. You must get back to your unit as soon as possible so as not to get into any serious trouble. They won't punish you too much for going AWOL, but you'll be in jail. A little bit. It will give you time to think and calculate whether your life is worth putting at risk because of dishonest people whom you considered a friend and a beloved girl. Anne intervened in her husband's speech and asked him, Mark, can't you get through to one of Nikita's commanding officers to, I don't know how to do it right, to issue a sort of confession? I don't want to see the guy's life derailed. They should probably look for him by now, and he'll show up on his own. That would be better. The man nodded approvingly, and after asking Thomas for his unit number, he left the kitchen to make the important calls. Eugenia poured the guy some tea, moved the vase of candy closer to him, and spoke softly. Inamas, it's hard for you right now, but believe me, all things are for the best. In my youth, there was a song where the words were such wonderful that if the bride goes to another, then you never know who is lucky. The woman softly began to hum the melody of a funny song with a funny refrain, and Thomas even had a smile on his face. By the time Mark returned to the kitchen, he looked almost calm. He didn't try to intrigue him and said, All right, tomorrow morning they'll bring a car for you, Thomas. Right up to our door. You'll get a ride back to your unit. My ex-soldier turns out to be on friendly terms with the commander of your unit. So the punishment will be more for order rather than for your intimidation. Understood. Thomas nodded. Now, after talking to these kind people who had unexpectedly crossed his path, he realized for himself that his desire for revenge was unlikely to lead to anything good. So he would have beaten Andrew, frightened, and insulted him. So what? It would not bring him back his friend or the girl he loved. So he decided for himself that he would not get his hands dirty. Let them marry, if that was what happened. And he would go off to serve, and then he would go off to serve, and then he would think of something later, when his head was cold. Anne had prepared her daughter's room for the guests' overnight stay, and Thomas, who was mentally and physically exhausted, fell asleep almost immediately. The landlady was busy putting the boys' clothes back to normal, and Mark, out of solidarity, did not go to bed, but sat next to his wife and told her army tales. They saw Thomas off in the morning. Eugenia didn't see the boy again until today. The first time they got word through Mark's acquaintance that Thomas was no longer a weirdo. After he was discharged from active duty, they never heard from him again. In addition, Anne's family, sometime after that fleeting acquaintance, was in so much turmoil that she'd even had time to forget about that little episode from the past. Anne would probably hardly have recognized the visibly grown-up Thomas. However, according to some signs known only to him, he recognized in an old woman begging by the store from the torments of life, a pretty woman who at that time no one gave her 53 years. And not only was he able to recognize her, but he apparently decided to repay her for the help she had given him years earlier. Tante Anne, I understand that you are short of money. Let's go to the store together. I was just on my way there to get some coffee. Because at work yesterday I poured the last spoonful out of the can, and my head is not thinking straight without caffeine. The woman met a soldier whom she helped 15 years ago, and now he helped her out. Excuse me, I got excited when I met you, and I'm talking nonsense. Let's go. We'll buy everything you need. Don't think about it. It'll be a pleasure for me. The older woman became embarrassed and began to address the man as you. Thomas, I'm sorry, but I really am. Only a dime for my daughter's favorite bun. It's her birthday, and we have a tradition. I've been giving her a bun like this since she was a kid. It's a tradition. There can be any kind of food on the table, even her own cake, but in the morning, she has to get the cherished bun. Thomas smiled and, supporting Anne under his arm, gradually dragged her toward the supermarket door and coaxed her in. "Tall traditions are wonderful, but I think we can get her some other goodies besides the bun. I think she'll enjoy it." The man didn't see his companion bite her lip, trying to hold back her tears. Soon they were inside the store. Thomas offered to go into the cake department, but Anne gently stopped him, and looking him straight in the eye, she spoke softly. "You know, Thomas, really, you don't need anything else but Emily and I's traditional bun. You don't need anything else but Emily and I's traditional bun," who had many different experiences in his life, was taken aback by the pain that sounded in the woman's voice and was evident in her eyes. He was completely confused and, obediently following the woman, followed the pastry and then to the cash register, completely forgetting about the need to buy coffee. The cashier said hello, as required by the instructions, did not pretend to recognize the old woman, and even tried not to raise her eyes at the customers, so as not to provoke a scandal. However, having deserved the customer, she looked at the strange couple, pondering the vicissitudes of fate. The girl was a little surprised at the behavior of the man, who seemed as if he even bowed down to the older woman, yet purchased only one not so expensive bun. "You could have splurged more, since you're such a philanthropist," thought the cashier. However, there were more and more customers in the store, and thoughts of the strange incident soon disappeared from her mind. Thomas helped Anne down the steps and suggested, "You know, let me give you a ride. I'm not tied to a strict schedule anyway, and it would be a pleasure to talk with you. 15 years ago, it would be a pleasure to talk with you. 15 years ago, it was you who put my mind in its place. So do not even refuse and tell me where to go." The man helped my Aunt Anne into the passenger seat and then sat behind the wheel and waited for the woman to give the required address. After a long sigh, she said, "To the town cemetery. I'm meeting my daughter there. I've been going there for 10 years. Embarrassed by other people's grief, the man apologized, murmured his condolences, and gently moved the car. He was embarrassed that he had broached an obviously painful subject for the woman, but she spoke up herself, telling the man the sad story of her life. "My daughter was a welcome and late child for my husband and me, so we adored her. We were glad she had found her love and got married. Of course, we were worried when she moved from us to her husband in this town. Then, when I was finally sent off to a well-deserved retirement, she kept suggesting that we move there. Mark and I wanted to be closer to our daughter, so we agreed. It was a shame to move away from the place we were used to, but we would do anything to see our daughter more often. Of course, we did not have enough money for a luxury apartment, but we bought a decent place in a good neighborhood with gardens nearby, and even a small lake to walk around in. After selling the old apartment, buying and moving into a new one, we even had a small amount left. Here we are, and my daughter and son-in-law gave some money for a car. They have long wanted, but somehow did not add up. If this idea be damned, it seems like we wanted the best, but it turned out I couldn't think of anything worse. Emily and her husband crashed on this piece of metal, bought with our material help. I still can't forgive myself." And Mark blamed himself so much, as if it was my son-in-law driving it. His parents also hated us for the damned car. So overnight we were in a strange city, with not a soul to speak of. Mark suffered a heart attack and left me for good. Maybe I wanted to go back to my town, where we had all been happy. But then I wouldn't be able to visit my beloved graves often, and I alone do not care where to live their lives, especially since the memory over the years does not get better. Today I forgot my wallet at home. Well, at least the transport card was in a pocket of my bag, although there is a good effect of forgetfulness. You see, I accidentally ran into you. The woman noticed that while she was telling Thomas the sad story of what had happened to her family, he had managed to park in front of the cemetery, and began to thank the unsuspecting benefactor, before whom she felt embarrassed. "Thank you for your kind heart, Thomas. Please forgive me. I must have disrupted your plans. And in general, I was talking a lot, telling about my life. Forgive me for being selfish. I did not even ask, how are you? How are you doing? The man had a strong desire to at least somehow support the woman who had endured so much hardship. And he suggested, Aunt Anne, don't patronize me. I'm still the same stupid, naive boy who thinks he's a vigilante to you. I don't even feel comfortable when you address me so respectfully. To be honest, it's likely that all my successes have their roots in the evening when you and Uncle Kostya helped me. Would you like me to go with you? Anne shook her head. Don't. I guess I'm alone to see her and give her a gift. Thank you again. All the best to you. Nikita thought that he could have an unplanned day off and spontaneously made a decision. He said, Aunt Anne, I'm not busy today and will wait for you as long as necessary. Take your time. I'll take you home afterwards. The old woman was uncomfortable, accepting help from a man she hardly knew. But Thomas looked at her kindly. It was felt that he was completely pure in his impulse, the woman agreed. It was felt that he was completely pure in his impulse, the woman agreed. Only my apartment is on the other side of town, as you've probably already realized. Thomas laughed. Not a problem. It's not that big of a town, I'll drive you there. And let's not argue. Anne agreed and went to meet her daughter. If only Emily and her husband were alive that fateful day. She often imagined that the terrible news of the death of her daughter and son-in-law in the accident would be a bad dream, except that what had happened could not be changed. It remained only to go to the graveyard to meet her only daughter and to visit her beloved husband, who had found his last shelter there. Anne's legs grew heavier with each step, but the woman was used to the effect. Although 10 years had passed since the tragic accident, it was incredibly difficult for her to accept the fact that her daughter had died. The woman walked to the humble monument, cleaned up the trash, collecting it in a preliminarily unsupportable bag, and, taking a bun from her bag, placed it on her daughter's grave. Now, here, Emily, is your favorite treat. Anne shared her pain with a long-time acquaintance. Of course, the woman was aware that talking to the monuments in the cemetery, not an example of sanity, but to refuse these conversations and monologues simply could not. She sat with her daughter Anne, got up heavily, and went to her husband's grave. It was impossible to bury them next to each other. But this inconvenience paled before the woman's grief. After the usual procedure of scavenging, she began to tell, looking at Mark's picture, of the morning's events, and reported that the good deed they had once done had not been done in vain. You and I, my love, had no idea then how it would turn out for us. It was kind of an insignificant acquaintance. And as a result, it was the ex-soldier who helped me speak out. Anne said goodbye to the people who were infinitely dear to her, but who were asleep forever. Back to Thomas's car, she sat down carefully in the passenger seat. The woman began to thank him again. Thank you, Thomas, for waiting. I hope I didn't take too long. The man smiled. It's all right, Aunt Anne, don't worry. Where are we going? Where are we going? The woman gave her address in the car, obeying the bold driver, set off. Anne tried to push away the sad thoughts of her daughter and husband, who had left her so early, and began to ask Thomas about how his life had turned out. But the road conditions were not conducive to a detailed answer. In addition, the man noticed that visiting the graves of loved ones had not gone unnoticed by the woman, and realized with surprise that he did not want to leave her alone now. Aunt Anne, what do you think about the fact that you and I now turn in some quiet cafe and sit normally, not on the run? Talk quietly. The woman made a counter-proposal. Thomas, why don't we sit at my place? It's quiet, and there won't be any strangers here. In fact, my outfit is hardly suitable for any kind of cafe. Thomas realized that the older woman was just not used to, or maybe she had forgotten what it was like to use a canteen as a place to eat and socialize. In addition, he thought that after visiting the cemetery, she was unlikely to enjoy any of the trappings of entertainment. Therefore, to make Aunt Anne feel comfortable, he agreed. You are very wise. And it's true, it will be easier that way. It's better to talk without extra eyes and ears. Give me the exact address. After hearing the necessary information, the man concentrated on the road. He understood that the time for frank conversations would come later. In the meantime, Aunt Anne needed at least a little rest from the psychologically difficult visit to the cemetery. Driving up to the woman's house, Thomas asked her, "What is your apartment number? I'll be up later. I have to take care of some business, okay?" The woman gave the number and complained, "I'm sorry, Thomas, I'm distracting you. I'll wait for you, of course, if you need me." Thomas was being a little sly. He didn't have any questions that required his urgent intervention. It was just that the man understood that it was unlikely that Aunt Anne was expecting guests, and, most likely, in order to please him, would put all her supplies on the table. So he decided to buy food for the table at the mini-mall, which he noticed in the building next door. Grocery shopping didn't take long. Soon, Thomas, laden with packages, was standing outside the apartment of the woman who had once helped him. Anne's aunt opened it almost instantly and was very surprised when the man brought in the bulky packages, sorting through their contents in the kitchen. She gasped with even more amazement. "Oh, Thomas, why did you buy all this stuff? There's cheese and sausage and chicken and fruit and even cake. Honestly, it's embarrassing." The man shrugged. "It's nothing. No embarrassment. On the contrary, I think it's the only right thing to do for the man who once helped me so much. You know, my dad always taught me that coming to a house empty-handed is the height of stinginess. So consider this a small compensation for my intrusion into your fate 15 years ago." The hostess declined to help me prepare a simple meal, and Thomas slowly began to look around. Anne's apartment was neatly tidy, and on the kitchen wall hung a photograph of her husband Mark, whom Thomas immediately recognized, and a young smiling girl who bore Aunt Anne's features. And there was no doubt that it was her daughter, Emily. Anne began to treat Thomas, and after a spontaneous lunch, the man began to talk briefly about everything that had happened to him since they had said goodbye. Upon my return to the unit, I was not pressed hard. Of course, I had to sit in the brig, but it was no big deal. I served my time as I was supposed to. The commander made me learn how to drive a car in order to keep my head occupied with regulations and other useful information, and I had no time to suffer for my fiancée. Of course, at first I remembered Andrew and Julia, planning how to get back at them to punish them for their betrayal. I thought of all sorts of things, and Thomas told me his thoughts. Anne even flinched when she heard such a frank confession, and Thomas rushed to reassure her. Then he cooled down. He began to think with his brain, not with his hurt ego. After all, clearly they would have thought of me if something had happened to the people who had betrayed me. They would have put me in jail for crying out loud, and that would have been too much of a blow for my father. He raised me alone since I was 10 years old after my mother died. I couldn't let him down like that. Anyway, I gave up plans for revenge, and I don't regret it. Except that I really wanted to prove to Julia that she was a fool for not waiting for me. For this, it was necessary to achieve something very significant. Some kind of almost sporting anger or something like that appeared. So when I was discharged in the reserve and came back home, I did not hesitate long and began to earn money diligently. I fixed cars, worked as a taxi driver. All in all, I made a living. It wasn't exactly a small town, but it was the same neighborhood, and I constantly ran into Andrew and Julia walking the stroller. Chances are one day I would have snapped. To be honest, though, the acute pain of betrayal was gone. There was still the resentment of disappointment. With my father's support, I decided to move, and that's how I ended up in this city. Victor, an army buddy, is from here. He first recommended me to a car service, and then, when he untwisted himself, I went to work for him. At the same time, Victor opened a business selling spare parts. And that's where things got off to a flying start. Of course, not right away. But why should I bother you with all the problems of the past? Then Victor decided to get into the food industry. And guess what? He succeeded. Now he has his own shop for smoked meats, delicatessen. And he put me in charge of that business. It turned out to be an interesting business, although I have practically no free time now. In general, everything worked out fine for me. Although I feared that I would have to, with my tail between my legs, go back to my dad's house. The woman listened to the man with interest and then asked Nikita, "You have a wife, or are you a bachelor walking around?" The man confessed, "I do, Aunt Anne. Father, that's my whole family. After my betrayal, I can't really fall in love with anyone. It's like 33 years, and I have nothing serious in my personal life." Anne did not start to lecture the man and encourage him. After sitting with the hospitable hostess for a while longer, Thomas went home. When he parted, he left her his phone number and made her promise that she would call him if she needed anything. It so happened that after a chance encounter outside the supermarket, Thomas and Anne began to communicate whenever possible. Neither he nor she had any relatives in town, and the loneliness brought them very close. At least once a week, if business allowed, Thomas would visit the elderly woman. Little by little, small problems in her apartment were eliminated, which could be solved with skillful hands. Anne, in turn, made it a rule to cook from the groceries Thomas brought in and hand him food in containers, saying, "Take it. I've cooked more than I can eat in a month. You'll save time." The grown man, who had not known a mother's affection for a long time, was used to this companionship. He reached out to Aunt Anne and in some ways quenched her need to care for someone. After a while, Anne left him a set of keys to her apartment. "Thomas, please take it just in case. You know, I'm not getting any younger as I get older. The neighbors with whom I had a good relationship have all moved away. What if I forget my keys and I can't even get home? Well, in case I suddenly get sick, come in handy." The man began to assure Aunt Anne that she was still quite awake and full of energy. But she was so insistent that he agreed. Communication between people of different generations had become almost a kinship relationship. Thomas even chose to celebrate the new year in the company of his dear Aunt Anne and his visiting father. He had been warned and showed up in advance with flowers. He knew from his son how many years ago this woman and her husband had talked Thomas out of doing rash things, and he was grateful to her. After meeting Aunt Anne, about whom his son had buzzed his ears, the man confessed, "Frankly, I imagined you as a gray-haired, wise old lady like Miss Marple from an old TV series. But you are a pretty woman of elegant age." The woman was pleased by the compliment. She herself had noticed that since Thomas had come into her life, it was as if her life had meaning. When she passed by the mirror, she no longer saw an old woman battered by the trials of life, but the first thing she noticed was the sparkle in her eyes. Her thoughts were no longer completely occupied with the memories of her family, whom she had never stopped loving, but she wasn't reducing herself to thinking now that tragedy might not have happened. Anne was sure that she had washed the positive emotions of communication from her soul with grief, and she thanked Michael from the bottom of her heart. "Thank you both for the compliment and for my son. He's a wonderful man." Thomas secretly hoped that getting to know Aunt Anne would encourage his father to think about moving away from his hometown, but in vain. After the holidays, Michael returned to his home and wanted to exchange phone numbers with Anne. But it was obvious that the spark of mutual romantic interest between them had not slipped. Thomas, however, didn't get upset about it. After all, both his dad and Aunt Anne, grown-ups who could figure out what they wanted in life. It had been more than 6 months since fate had brought Anne and Thomas together again, when he had to go on a business trip. A men's holiday was approaching, and on his return he decided to make a little detour and stop in his hometown to congratulate his father and spend some time with him. When they met, of course, they also talked about Anne. Michael asked, "How is your mentor doing? Is she not suffering from pressure? Surrounding himself with business?" After these questions, Nikita suddenly realized that he had not heard from Aunt Anne for several days and began to dial the familiar number. There was no answer, and both men became worried. Michael advised his son, "Don't suffer the suspense. Go home, but when you get there, be sure to let me know what's going on." On the way, Thomas tried to call Aunt Anne again, but to no avail. Without even stopping by his house, he rushed to see the woman who had become so near and dear to him. Thomas rang the doorbell, but no one opened. And then, tormented by the darkest forebodings, he used his keys. The man expected to see anything but a frightened teenage girl. She had a terry towel turban on her head and was dressed in her Aunt Anne's robe. The stranger was sitting in the kitchen, eating soup straight from the pot. Thomas asked sternly, "Who are you and where is Auntie Mistress?" The girl looked at him wide-eyed, putting her spoon aside. "My name is Jane, and I don't do anything wrong. Aunt Anne had something wrong with her phone, and she went to show it to a repair shop to get it fixed. She told me to sit quietly and not open the door for anyone. Aunt Anne had left a long time ago, so I was even hungry. Here, I thought I'd get something to eat." Before Thomas could say anything, Anne came home. When she saw Thomas, she was incredibly happy. "Thomas, how nice of you to drop by. I was just about to call you. My phone is off and won't turn on. I've been to every repair shop in the area. Everywhere they say I should leave my phone, but I'm dying to get in touch with you. The number is not recorded anywhere except in the phone memory. There's nothing more reliable than a notebook. I was relying on technology, and I got in trouble. I'll have to ask you to fix it. You get undressed, wash your face, and sit down at the table. It looks like we're going to have a long talk." Tormented by curiosity, Thomas could not wait long. Sitting down at the table, he asked, "Talk. Don't drag out the intrigue." The elderly woman began to tell anyway. "I found Jane in front of the driveway, just like I found you once. This fool ran away from home. Can you imagine? She didn't even leave a note for her parents. I can't even imagine how they go crazy." The girl blushed and interrupted the landlady. "Well, how do you not understand? I thought that I would meet my loved one here, that I congratulate him on the holiday in peace. My parents, I'm sure, have not even missed that I'm not home yet. My father is definitely already celebrating the holiday with his drinking buddies, and he probably doesn't even remember that he has a family and my mom has a lover on the side. Everybody knows about him, including my dad, which only out and saw the picture. My boyfriend was kissing some girl. They didn't even notice me until I got close. Then he stood there, silent as a statue. Well, I didn't say anything either. I turned around in silence and went wherever I was going. Somewhere along the way, my purse and phone were taken out of my bag. I found myself in an almost hopeless situation. I thought I would go in the direction of the train station. Slowly, they would try to go to the police station to get home. How to walk? Tired, I sat down on the bench, where my Aunt Anne found me. She saw that I was confused and frozen and brought me to her. Thomas, listening to the teenager's confession, asked, "Jane, do you remember any of your parents' numbers?" Anne and Thomas helped the girl who ran away from home. The girl nodded. The man held out his machine to her and commanded imperiously, "Call immediately and let me know you're all right." Jane complied. Anne gave Thomas a satisfied nod, showing that she was very grateful. After the girl talked to her mother, she pressed off, returned the phone to Thomas, and informed her new acquaintances in surprise. "Can you believe it? My mother noticed that I wasn't home after all. She said she even wanted to call her friends and hospitals. She said she loved me, and was worried. Anne turned away so that none of her guests would notice the tears that came to her eyes. Thomas asked where Jane lived, and to his great surprise, she named his hometown. The man shrugged his shoulders. Well, I guess fate is giving me a chance to talk to my father again, because I had snapped out of it suddenly, even though I had planned to stay for a couple of days. Aunt Anne, if you want to go visit, I'm sure Dad will be glad to see you. Woman Thomas refused, so he didn't insist. He advised the girl to block the SIM card that was in her old cell phone, helped her find the coordinates of the cellular operator, and suggested, "Look, if you want, you can also report it to the police. But, frankly, given that you do not even approximately know where your stuff was stolen, the result will be zero. Take your loss as payment for the experience." The girl nodded. She didn't want to get involved in the red tape herself, though she felt sorry for the phone. After Jane dried her hair and her clothes with the hairdryer, the landlady escorted her guests out, wishing them a safe journey. Thomas turned on the radio softly, and to the sound of the music, his young companion dozed off. She looked so defenseless in her sleep, so trusting, that the man had a lump in his throat. He imagined that maybe someday he would have a daughter who would be tempted to leave everything and run away from home to a guy he hardly knew. The thought made him uncomfortable. Thomas even shook his head, shaking off the illusion and realizing, oh man, I guess I'm getting old. I'm starting to think about my kids. That's what Dad says. That's what Dad says. To the sound of music, the car rolled into Thomas's hometown, and he called out to Jane. "Hey, can you tell me where to go next?" As the girl explained that they had recently moved into a new building. It's a neighborhood where houses are like birdhouses, window to window with neighbors, and infrastructure is not yet developed, but at a budget price. The old apartment in the center, though it was smaller in size, was more expensive. I myself do not know exactly how to get there from where we are now. For now, you can take Central Avenue from the Steel. I'll show you the way. Thomas, who wasn't too good at navigating the new areas of his hometown either, had to navigate on the navigator. Soon they arrived at their destination. For some reason, Jane was slow to get out of the car, and Nikita guessed, "What? Are you afraid of getting hit by your parents? Don't be trepidatious. They'll just be happy to have you back. You'll just be happy to have you back. Walk me out too much trouble. Walk me out. I'm sure they won't scold me too much in front of you, and then everything will calm down." Thomas sighed. When the girl opened the door of her apartment and her parents came out into the hallway, Thomas, who had been preparing a speech to defend the unreasonable girl, was simply speechless. Opposite him stood Andrew and Julia, a former friend and a former lover. Now the man realized that in the image of Jane he vaguely grasped the features of the girl who had broken his heart years ago. That was probably why he was subconsciously admiring her in the car. Pauline introduced her companion embarrassedly. Dad, this is Thomas. He and Aunt Anne helped me." Julia came to her senses and didn't let on that she knew her devoted fiancé. "To meet you. Well, however, Andrew, who was tipsy as his daughter had suggested, kept a long-standing acquaintance with Thomas." "What people?" "My friend Thomas." "What a joke." "Julia, don't you recognize Thomas? It's not like he's changed much. Come on in, buddy. Let's celebrate." The woman had to pretend that she only now recognized her ex-fiancé, and every now and then she started flirting. "Oh my God, my eyesight's gone bad. I didn't recognize you, Thomas. You'll be rich. Come on in. I'll set the table quickly." Surprised, Jane asked her mother, "Do you all really know each other?" "That's cool. So I didn't go to another city for nothing. I brought an old friend home." However, the woman did not share her daughter's joy and expressively looked at her and mouthed, Then with you we will have a separate conversation. For now, go to the kitchen and peel the potatoes, put them to boil, and put the cutlets in the oven." The girl snorted, but hoping that her meekness would help her avoid serious punishment for her transgression in the future, went into the kitchen. Thomas wanted to turn around and leave, but Andrew grabbed him by the arm and dragged him into the living room. "Come on, make yourself at home. We haven't seen each other for so long. I used to see you coming, just getting ready to say hello, and you turned somewhere. Then I found out you moved out of town. Well, we had some misunderstandings in the past, but it's been so many years now. Why bring up old grudges?" The owner shouted toward the kitchen. "Julia, what are you doing like a turtle? Bring us something to eat and some glasses and a bottle of something stronger. Don't you see? A friend's here to see me." It was unpleasant to see and hear a drunken traitor calling him a friend. But Andrew had such a firm grip on his arm that he would have had to use force to free himself, and he didn't feel like fighting. The thought throbbed in his head that Jane might well be his daughter, but he had no idea how to tactfully clarify this information. Jane came to his aid and began to share the details of his family life. "You're in the army." Julia was completely demoralized, sad, crying. "So one day I could not stand it," began to kiss her. She didn't resist, by the way. Thomas wanted to get up and leave, not to hear about the past events that had brought him such pain. But he decided that he couldn't constantly avoid what was unpleasant, so he continued to listen to Andrew's revelations. "I told you everything honestly in my letter, so you can't have a complaint against me. Besides, frankly speaking, your fiancée, that is, my wife, is a piece of work. She probably thinks I don't know about her man walking. Naive. Even my daughter probably knows about it. So consider it, friend, that I saved you from a womanizer," Nikita said sadly. "You never know who's lucky." Julia burst into the room, managed to dress up in a dress that tightened all her feminine curves, and began to arrange the plates on the table while glancing at Thomas. The man took advantage of the fact that Andrew finally let go of his hand, busy pouring the drink into shot glasses, and got up from the couch. "I'll thank you guys, but I have to go. I promised my dad I'd stop by." Andrew, who had managed to knock over the contents of his shot glass, began to talk Thomas out of it, but he was already hurrying to get dressed. Pauline looked out at the noise, waved her hand in which she held the potatoes, and shouted, "And thank you, and say hello to Aunt Anne. Say hello to Aunt Anne." Thomas left the apartment of his betrayers with a feeling of great relief, and, getting into his car, did not move for some time. Even with his impressive driving experience, he had never sat behind the wheel in such an agitated state. After a series of deep breaths and exhalations, he finally calmed down and drove to his father's house. Michael was surprised to see his son on the doorstep again. "Nikita, I keep waiting for you to call me and report what's up with Anne, and you decided to come yourself." "It's okay." The young man recounted to his father all the events that had happened, not forgetting to mention the unexpected visit to the traitor's apartment. Michael saw that his son was concerned about more than just the unpleasant encounter, and asked directly, "What has thrown you out of your equilibrium the most? Do you think Jane might be your daughter?" Thomas wasn't even surprised by his father's insight, for he had always been his best advisor and trusted friend, as if he could read his mind with ease. "You see, I don't know when Jane's birthday is, but she looks about 14 or 15. I mean, she could be. Can you imagine?" Michael began as best he could to reassure his son. "You know, some secrets are better left alone. What's in it for you? The truth. Do you have fatherly feelings for the girl by paying her alimony? Or are you going to move Andrew and start a family with Julia and the daughter she inexplicably gave birth to from either of you?" Thomas himself didn't know what he wanted or why he needed to know the truth. He honestly confessed, "I don't know either, but it just doesn't seem right. And besides, the girl doesn't really look like me or Andrew. But Julia's features are clearly visible. I'm afraid that if I call her and start asking questions, she'll just tell me to fuck off and be right. After all, I myself do not know why I want to clarify everything. The father did not know how to help his grown-up son, and the silence in the room was interrupted by the ringing of the telephone. Thomas answered and heard Julia's voice. I was so confused I didn't even thank you for bringing the girl home. She told me briefly what kind of trouble she was in, and I don't know how to express my gratitude to you and that woman. I didn't even know you had someone in that town. Or was it your wife's mother? Thomas didn't explain anything. He listened to his former lover without interrupting, and Julia poured in a sweet-voiced bird. Honey, can't we meet and talk not over the phone but look each other in the eye? I am guilty before you, but I could at least try to justify myself so you wouldn't hold it against me. The man didn't want to see Julia again at all, but he suddenly thought she wouldn't be able to lie to him when they met and tell him who her daughter was with. He suggested, I'll still be in town tomorrow, and if you insist, let's meet in the park by the fountain. Julia laughed, that sensual laugh that once drove Thomas crazy, and explained, There's no fountain in our park anymore. They put a diner in its place, proudly called a restaurant. In the warmer months, there's a miscommunication bubbling around, and in the winter there's nothing to suggest why the place is called the Fountain. Anyway, tell me what time it's convenient for you to meet. I'll certainly be there. Thomas, who had long ago grown weary of the wordy girl, who enjoyed the way the words weaved in and out of massive, ornate phrases, offered, would 12 o'clock in the afternoon suit you? The former lover agreed and said goodbye, remembering to clarify, See you tomorrow then. Before 12:00, I look forward to seeing you, Thomas. Although the father didn't listen to his son's phone conversation, he had no trouble understanding who had called him and began to discourage the meeting. Whatever Julia tells you, Thomas agreed. He sat with his father for a while longer, then informed Aunt Anne that the girl had been safely delivered home and handed over to her parents, and went to bed. He had a difficult meeting tomorrow and needed to build up his morale. 15 minutes before the appointed time, Thomas was already at the arranged place, and he looked into a quite decent-looking establishment. He reserved a table and ordered light refreshments. He admitted to himself that he was very nervous, although he did not feel any guilt towards Julia. Anyway, he could not sit still. He left the restaurant for the street to get some relatively fresh air and saw Julia walking along the path, gracefully avoiding the tracks left by the dogs, whose owners, despite prohibitory signs, always walked in the park. Julia had grown only slightly fatter over the years, and was perhaps even more attractive than in Thomas's memories, except that because of a long-standing resentment, the mature beauty of a woman who knew all her advantageous angles and clothes hardly affected him anymore. As if sensing that she was being watched, Julia looked up from the path. She looked straight at Thomas and waved to him, greeting him. Soon she was standing in front of him and even reached out to kiss him, but the man ducked and informed her, I've already ordered appetizers, so let's go to the table. Don't put on a show in front of passers-by. The man even thought that Julia was offended, but she laughed. Oh, you look serious. What? Are you afraid to compromise me? What a noble knight. Thomas answered nothing, and opening the door in front of the woman, he escorted her to the table. She gracefully threw off her short, mink-hooded jacket and threw it on the hangers beside her, as if she hadn't noticed that her companion hadn't even tried to help her. Thomas sat down at the table opposite his former lover, and as hard as he looked, he couldn't see a shadow of excitement on her face. Yesterday she had been real, agitated, a little nervous and irritable. But today, in front of him was a woman, confident in her omnipotence. Julia looked very fresh, and her mane of blonde hair, gathered in a tall hairdo, was not at all crumpled under the hood. Thomas remembered this amazing ability of his former lover to look royal, even after a stormy dance, but resolutely cut short his thoughts of the past. Looking the woman in the eye, without polite phrases about anything, he asked her a straightforward question. "Tell me, is Jane my daughter?" The woman was not confused, and shaking her head she replied, "No." Much to my regret, Jane was born 10 months after our last date, when I visited you for the oath of office. It would have been wonderful if she had been your own daughter. But her biological father is Andrew. I'd really like to make up for the stupid things I've done in the past, but that's unrealistic. I realized that I acted like a jerk when I didn't wait for you from the army, but life has punished me for that. I married Andrew thinking he adored me so much that he even betrayed my friendship, and I was just a trophy to him. It was like he was unofficially competing with you, and once he got the prize, he calmed down, stopped lavishing adoration on me. When I wanted to leave him and divorce him, I realized that I was expecting a child. I couldn't bear to have a fatherless child, so I put up with it. When Jane came along, I had nowhere else to go. Besides, Andrew turned out to be a great dad. He sees his daughter is the light in the window, but even she's losing out to the drinking competition. Andrew has long been addicted to the glass and has long since gone from weekly beers on Fridays to more frequent and lavish libation. Thomas met the friend and fiancé who betrayed him 15 years ago. For the past 10 years, it's been like I've been living my life, not with my man, not in my world, trying to find joy among the gray days. But any entertainment is only enough for a short time. You know, I realize that it's a useless fuss and a disappointment. Punishment for the way I treated you. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I really wish you wouldn't curse me so much. You're still, I feel, the same generous guy I knew you to be. I'm embarrassed to suggest this, but maybe we can try to rekindle our feelings again. There's a cozy hotel nearby where we can rent a room for a few hours and talk in private. Remember our golden years of youth. The man listened to the traitor's complaints about the life that had not turned out the way she wanted, but he could not get even a single word of sympathy out of himself, and he was quite surprised by her frank offer. The girl, interrupting her monologue, asked, "Thomas, are you even listening to me?" The man nodded, and the man nodded. "Everything I needed to know, I've already heard. You know, I should probably go. Goodbye." Thomas gestured for the bill and, after paying, left the establishment. He walked down the lane and didn't know how he felt. For one thing, everything was clear. Jane, not his daughter, but somehow this information did not bring relief. He felt sorry for the girl whose parents had either never loved each other or had failed to preserve their feelings. The man became incredibly sad and rushed to the common house to share the news with his father. The father was not at all surprised. "I thought so, surprised. But why are you hanging your nose? On the contrary, you should be glad. You have nothing to do with this woman. In fact, you can even mentally thank Andrew and put a candle for his health. If it weren't for his hormone surge, you'd be suffering with Julia right now. It all worked out for the best. Now you should feel free of the resentment that has been languishing in your soul." Thomas found the strength to smile. "It turns out that way. Only I guess I still have to get used to the feeling. It's too unaccustomed. A father hugged his son. The father hugged his son, you'll get used to it. Especially since you have so many opportunities now. If you want, you can come back to our city forever. After all, an unintentional encounter with this couple will no longer cause you suffering, or you can fall in love again. After all, your ex-girlfriend has shown her rotten nature in all its glory, and you'll finally stop subconsciously comparing everyone to her." Thomas actually felt incredibly light, relieved of his moral burden. He no longer had the slightest desire for revenge against Andrew and Julia. After the holiday spent in his hometown, Thomas returned to the metropolis, where his work and his anxious aunt and were waiting for him. On the phone, the man informed her that she had been completely right in the past when she sang him a joke song about an unfaithful bride. And the woman realized that something very important had happened. Having sorted out the business and successfully negotiated several promising contracts to supply the firm's products to retail outlets, Thomas arrived at her aunt's house. The man had told her without concealment, as a close person, the details of the meeting with Andrew and Julia, and caused a storm of emotions, which he concluded with the unexpected phrase, "Yeah, I feel sorry for Jane more than anyone else in this situation. The poor girl looks at her weak-willed father who drinks, and her impudent mother who thinks that the child does not understand anything. I can't even imagine the hell Jane lives in. It's no wonder she ran off to the first guy she could find, the one who knows how to fill your brain with compliments. Too bad she wasn't your daughter. Then there would have been a chance to show her a normal life without the lies and mutual irritation of her parents. At least a little." Thomas couldn't agree more with the wise woman. "You know, Aunt Anne, I feel sorry for Jane too, but I realize that she is the only thread that connects her parents. If she leaves the family, everything will fall apart. So even if you or I were to suggest that Jane move out, I don't think it would do any good." Emily's birthday was approaching, and Thomas himself offered his aunt's wife his services to accompany the woman. She didn't refuse. "I am touched by your sensitivity and kindness. I am touched by your sensitivity and kindness. Would I have thought that a brief companionship with a tormented soldier would have such lasting and pleasant consequences?" That traditionally, Anne bought a lush, appetizing bun as a gift for her daughter, and Thomas waited patiently while the woman visited the graves of loved ones. Just like a year ago, Aunt Anne returned to the cabin of his car. Sad and worried, Thomas remained tactfully silent. It was only at the very end of the journey that he decided to lighten the mood by confessing, "I think I'm beginning to have an affair." As such news could not leave a woman indifferent. She rejoiced. Great. It's high time we had an affair, or even a serious relationship. What's wrong with such a man living alone? There must be no shortage of unmarried neighbors and co-workers. And you're still a bachelor. Thomas, however, was not so optimistic. The problem is that she had a story in life as if mirrored mine. While she was busy working hard to earn money for her wedding, her fiancé managed to marry someone else. They were practically having an affair in front of my Mary. She was out the door to run to her second job, and her friend and fiancé were staying and having fun. So now my beloved has absolutely no faith in the honesty of men. Anne reassured her younger friend, who has become like a son to her, and smoothed the pain of losing her daughter. It just takes a little time for her to get to know you better. Once she gets to know how wonderful you are, she'll fall in love, and she won't go anywhere. Where else will she find a man like that? Nowhere else will she find a man like that. Nowhere else. I can tell you that." Thomas opened up. "She's been seeing me for about 3 months now, but she doesn't show that she's ready for anything more. I'm not happy about opening up to her anymore. It's a shame she doesn't say yes or no." After an expression of extreme surprise, the woman asked, "Look, Thomas, why don't you come visit me with her? I'll look at her, and believe me, I'll know if she's interested in you for her wealth or her heart's desire. You can plan a visit in a week. All the more reason. It's my birthday, and for the first time since my daughter and husband left, I wanted to celebrate it with people I can't imagine my life without. I've already invited your father, and of course you and Mary will be waiting too." A week later, the smartly dressed birthday girl, who had visited a small beauty salon to celebrate, was welcoming guests. The first to arrive was Daddy Thomas, who arrived early and got into the trouble of preparing the holiday dishes on his own. For a man who actually raised his son alone, household chores did not cause any difficulties. and the two of them and Anne quickly completed all the preparations and even managed to get some rest. Thomas and his companion showed up without delay. After introductions were made, Anne invited everyone to the table. Mary sat opposite the hostess and sometimes peered intently into her face, as if she reminded her of someone. The eldest of the party made some good wishes, and then his son took the floor, and then his son took the floor. Your dear Aunt Anne, the story of our acquaintance and reunion is quite unusual. Like everyone else, I want to thank you for your beautiful soul, kind heart, and even for your forgetfulness. After all, if you hadn't forgotten your purse at home a little over a year ago, who knows when we would have met again. At these words, Mary let the raised glass out of her hand and cried out, then it must be you. Only you didn't look the same then as you do now. I looked closely and I couldn't tell whether it was you or not. I often thought of you and scolded myself for not helping you. I acted as I should have, but not according to my conscience. Forgive me. And the guest looked at the girl, not understanding anything. The girl explained, "A year ago, I was a part-time cashier in a supermarket. You were a little short, and I refused to sell you a bun. You know, I'm incredibly embarrassed, and you're probably not happy to see me. Again, I apologize. I'm sorry, and please don't be mad at me." The girl got up from the table to leave, but the woman, following her guest, managed to intercept her, gently touching her arm. "See, on the contrary, I am incredibly grateful to you. I am incredibly grateful to you precisely because I had to look for the missing amount." We met with Thomas. Mary was shocked to the core. I didn't recognize him when I met him. I almost didn't get a good look at him then. But I remembered you very well because of my sense of shame. The girl's face was scarlet. She was really uncomfortable, but Thomas suggested, "Let's nobody go anywhere. Let's go back to the table and continue to honor our wonderful birthday girl and all the happy coincidences that brought us all together." The tension that had arisen quickly dissipated, and soon they were all heatedly discussing the curiosities and amusements of fate that had brought Thomas to Aunt Anne's aid. Mary, realizing that no one present condemned her principled nature, relaxed and began to feel much more comfortable. At the request of the birthday girl, there was even a dance between meals, and the girl danced with Thomas. She tried her best to help Anne, but the men completely took upon themselves the main troubles, and that delighted the representatives of the fair sex. After the party, which began so unusually, Anne informed Thomas, who called her, "Don't even doubt that you will have a very good time with Mary. She's a wonderful girl who has both conscience and firmness to adhere to his ideals, in addition to honest." She knew that I didn't recognize her, and she knew that I didn't recognize her, and she could have kept silent in order not to jeopardize your relationship. But for her, it was all about honesty. "Nikita, that's wonderful. Don't you dare pass this girl up." Thomas once again sincerely thanked the woman. "Thank you. I'm very glad you appreciated my beloved. You know, I'll probably propose to her right tonight. If she agrees, then I invite you to attend our wedding." And was pleased by this attention, and was genuinely worried when Thomas delayed in, letting her know how Mary had reacted to his proposal to become his wife. However, the man called late in the evening and cheerfully informed her, "Get ready for a parade out and a little trip. We want to play the wedding for 2 days, one here and one in my hometown." The woman was incredibly happy for Thomas, and she sincerely wanted the man to be happy. She, knowing that he had experienced a double betrayal, was happy that he had not become embittered at the world. At Anne's merry wedding, she stood up and made a toast. "My dears, you wished me a lot of things, and I want to remind you that in a family, the main thing is trust. If you do not lie to each other and sly, you will have a very strong union. In addition, I wish that all the coincidences in your lives bring only joy." Anne was genuinely happy for the newlywed couple and thought that for the sake of true love, they had gone through difficult trials and were ready to continue to fight for their happiness. The magnificently dressed woman, who had once unwittingly caused the bride to feel ashamed, rejoiced along with the other guests. Much had changed in Aunt Anne's life. She knew that if anything happened now, the people who had become relatives would surely come to her rescue. Thomas is happy with his beloved woman, and good times have begun for Eugenia, because she has found people close to her.